Okay, so it's 1930, and you're 4 days out of Liverpool, on a cargo ship hauling coal and mixed freight toward Montreal. Your cabin is the smallest room aboard that isn't a locker. It sits high up, near the funnel, so it stays warm even in the North Atlantic. There's a bench, a hand key under your right palm, and a receiver in front of you that hisses for hours at a time. The headphones stay on. Above the desk, there's a clock with red wedges painted onto the face. You watch them come around, twice an hour, every hour you're awake. Below you, some 30 men are working the ship. Every one of them can point at what they did. Coal moves, paint goes on, the engine turns over. You produce nothing anybody can point at. And on a British ship in this decade, chances are you aren't on the shipping company's books at all. Someone else pays you to sit in their room, on their ship, for the length of the crossing. So what is this ship actually paying for when it pays for you? The man in the radio room is the elite of the crew. He holds a certificate nobody else aboard holds. He reads a language the deck officers can't. And he's the only link between a steel box in the middle of the ocean and everything else. Rare certificate, high price. That's the version everyone knows. Now look at the pay. Commonly cited figures for the wireless operators on the big Atlantic liners put it at around £2, 2 shillings and 6 pence a month from the shipping line, and roughly £4 a month from the wireless company. Add both, £6 and change. Two things about that number. The first is that it takes two separate employers to reach it. Neither one, on its own, pays a living wage. The second is that this figure comes from the top of the trade. Passenger liner, prestige route, 2 operators working shifts, a chief and a junior. That isn't the man on the coal ship. Records survive from the prestige end of any trade. They almost always do. Because that room isn't free. It takes space on a ship that earns by volume. It needs power, a bunk, a bulkhead, and a man who eats 3 times a day for the length of the voyage. Somebody decided that cost was worth paying, and somebody wrote down why. Which brings up the obvious question. If the pay is ordinary, and the work produces nothing the crew can see, why is this man aboard at all, in a room built for him, on a ship that charges for every square foot twice? He isn't aboard because a ship owner wanted him there. He's aboard because of a sentence written after a disaster, in a language no sailor speaks. You weren't hired to run a radio, you were hired to be a line in a treaty. This is the 4th kind of extinction this channel tracks, regulatory erasure, not a machine that undercut the job, and not a collapse in the price of what the job produced. A rule created this profession, and one amendment to that rule ended it on a date you can look up. Start with how the rule got written. On the 15th of April 1912, a passenger liner struck ice in the North Atlantic and sank. More than 1,500 people died. A ship close enough to have helped had a wireless set aboard, and nobody sitting at it. That second fact is the one that mattered legally. Between November 1913 and January 1914, delegates from 13 countries and their colonies met in London and drafted the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea. It was signed on the 20th of January 1914. The First World War interrupted ratification, so the text reached the fleet through national legislation, rather than in one clean stroke. But the substance held. Ships carrying more than 50 people were to be fitted with a radio telegraph installation, and the installation was to be watch. Read that as 2 separate obligations, because that's what it was, equipment and a person. The United States had already gone down the same road. Its 1910 Wireless Act was amended in July 1912, and the amendment required enough operators aboard to keep a continuous listening watch. Not a radio. Operators, plural, because one human being cannot stay awake for a crossing. That is the whole origin of the job. A treaty clause converted a piece of hardware into a staffing requirement. Now, the structural point. The economic demand underneath that clause was real, and it wasn't the shipowner's demand. Shipowners were not asking for a 54th crew member. The demand came from passengers, from insurers, and from governments answering to newspapers. All three of them wanted the ocean to stop being a place where a ship could disappear without anyone hearing. None of the three paid for it directly. The cost landed on the ship owner, and the ship owner handled it the way any operator handles a mandated cost. Find the cheapest compliant way to satisfy the inspector. So a market appeared for exactly that. A company that would install a set, supply a certified man, and hand the ship owner a piece of paper. On paper, this works, and it worked for 85 years. There was never one kind of radio officer. There were four, and the gap between the top and the middle is where most of the misunderstanding about this trade lives. The first grade is the one the records remember. Chief operator on a passenger liner, working an Atlantic or Far East route. 2 or 3 men in the radio room, shifts around the clock, uniform with braid, dining arrangements closer to the officers than the crew. This man handled paying traffic all day, passenger telegrams, priced by the word. The second grade is the ship you're actually on. Cargo vessel, 1 operator, no relief. He cannot keep a continuous watch alone, and everybody involved knows it. So the law bends. The obligation becomes a watch of a certain number of hours per day in the aggregate, maintained by the radio officer, with a mechanical device covering the hours he's asleep. In United States law, that aggregate figure sat at 8 hours a day, and that number survived on the statute books into the 1990s. 8 hours of human watch, 16 hours of a machine listening for one specific alarm signal. Hold on to that, it comes back. This second grade was most of the trade. Most merchant ships are cargo ships, and most cargo ships carried 1 man. The third grade never went to sea. Coast station operators, working shore-based stations that relayed ship traffic into the land telegraph network. Same certificate, same examination, regular hours, a house, the best deal in the trade, and the hardest to get into. The fourth grade only appears at the end. From the 1960s onward, the man in that room stopped being purely a communicator and became the ship's electronic specialist. Radar, direction finding, later satellite terminals and navigation gear. British Union records show the title itself changing to include electronics. That grade earned more and carried more. It also, without anyone announcing it, changed what the job was for. We'll come back to that. For the rest of this, when we talk money, we're talking about grade 2. 1 man, cargo ship, no passenger traffic. That's the median of this profession, and it's the grade the survival math has to be run on. Getting the certificate cost money, and almost none of it was optional. You started at a telegraphy school. Private colleges taught Morse to commercial speed, plus regulations, plus enough electrical theory to keep a spark transmitter alive at sea. Months of tuition, paid up front, at an age when you had no income. Documented tuition figures for these schools are inconsistent across countries and decades, so take the shape rather than the number. It was the sort of sum a family paid, or a wireless company advanced against your future wages. Then the examination fee, paid to a government authority for the certificate itself. Then the examination fee, then a uniform, because you signed on as an officer even when your pay wasn't officer pay. Then travel. You didn't join a ship where you lived. You joined it where the company put it, which meant a rail fare to a port, sometimes a foreign one, sometimes on your own account. Then union dues. Once organized representation existed for this grade. And then there's the part almost nobody accounts for. Your certificate was issued by one country's authority, and it was valid on that country's ships. Change flag and you were not a radio officer anymore. You were a man holding a foreign document, facing another examination in another regulator's syllabus. Every other trade aboard could walk to a different flag and keep working. A cook is a cook. A greaser is a greaser. Your entire qualification existed inside one legal system, because the job itself existed inside one legal system. So the real cost of entry wasn't the tuition. It was buying an asset that only one jurisdiction would honor, and then watching that jurisdiction remain the sole customer for it. Here's a choice. Pick one before you hear the answer. 2 things kept this profession alive for most of a century. One is the distress watch, the legal duty to listen for ships in trouble. The other is commercial traffic, the paid telegrams that moved through that room and generated invoices. Which one was the job's economic foundation? Nearly everyone picks the distress watch, because that's the story. The ice, the treaty, the man at the key. It's also the answer that makes moral sense. It's the wrong one. The distress watch never generated a single unit of revenue, not one. It was the reason the job was legally required, and it was worth nothing to anybody who paid for it. Read that again. The paying customer and the legal justification were two different things, pointed at two different parts of the job. That gap is the entire structure of this profession, and it explains both why the pay was ordinary and why the ending was so abrupt. Work through it from the shipowner's side. A shipowner buys compliance. He needs an inspector to sign off, so he needs a certified man aboard. What he does not need is for that man to be busy. The distress watch has no output he can sell, and no output he can measure. It's a cost line that produces a piece of paper. That's the whole value to him, paper. Now the wireless company's side. It installed the set, it supplied the man, and it billed for messages. Passenger telegrams on a liner were priced per word. Commonly cited rates from the period put a 10-word minimum at around 12 shillings and sixpence, with something near 7 pence for each word after that. Compare that against what the man sending it earned per month, and the ratio does the talking. So the revenue existed, but it lived on passenger routes. On a cargo ship there were no passengers to bill, which means grade 2, the majority of this profession, sat in a room whose commercial justification was happening on somebody else's ship. He was pure compliance. Nothing else. And a pure compliance job has one specific property. Its wage is capped not by the value it creates, but by the cost of the cheapest legal alternative. As long as no legal alternative existed, that cap sat wherever the labor market put it. The moment a legal alternative existed, the cap went to zero. Not down, to zero. Which brings us back to the 16 hours. From the middle of the century, a mechanical device covered the hours the single operator slept, an alarm receiver, listening for one signal, capable of waking him. Think about what that admits. Regulators had already accepted, in writing, that a machine could hold the distress watch, 2/3 of the day, on most ships in the fleet. The technology to remove the human wasn't invented in the 1990s. It was in the room, accepted and legal, decades earlier. The job outlived its own technical necessity by a very long time. It survived because the remaining third had a person's name written next to it in law. Now, the other side of the ledger. Follow the money as it actually moved. Start with the two pay packets. On British ships through much of this period, the operator's wage came from two sources. A small sum from the shipping line, and a larger one from the wireless company whose equipment he ran. Records around the 1912 liners describe exactly this split. That arrangement tells you where he stood. He lived aboard a ship, ate the ship's food, obeyed the ship's master, and answered to a company whose office was ashore. When his employer's contract with a shipping line ended, his berth ended, regardless of how well he had worked. He wasn't a member of that crew in any commercial sense. He was equipment that came with an operator attached, leased by the voyage. The traffic chain worked the same way. A passenger writes a message. The wireless company sets the rate and collects the fee. The message goes ship to shore, then into a land telegraph network run by a state post office or a cable company, and both of those take a cut. The passenger pays once. 3 organizations divide it. The man who actually sent it is on a monthly wage. His share of that fee is 0. That's not an accusation. It's a payment structure, and it was printed on the tariff card. Piece rates existed all over the maritime economy in this period. They were never applied here. If they had been, Grade 2 would have earned almost nothing, because Grade 2 had almost no billable traffic. So the wage protected him from the structure. It also detached him from it completely. Then come the deductions, the ones that reach into the packet before it reaches him. Advances against tuition, where the company had funded his training. Union dues, once representation existed. Uniform upkeep, rail fares to join a ship, where they weren't reimbursed. and the gap between contracts, which nobody paid for, and which will count properly later. Consistent figures for those deductions don't survive across flags and decades, so no numbers here. Every one of them ran the same way. And there's one more thing missing from the ledger, which is the thing everybody assumes is there. There was no premium for the distress watch, no hardship rate, no on-call rate. The one duty that was the entire legal reason for his presence came bundled, free, inside a commercial contract about telegrams. Something with no price has nothing to defend when it gets cheaper. Here's the detail that survived best, and it describes this trade better than any wage figure. Twice an hour, on the distress frequency, everyone stopped transmitting, 3 minutes at a time, from the top of the hour to 3 minutes past, and from half past to 3 minutes after. Across the whole ocean, every set went quiet, and every operator listened. The point was simple. A ship in trouble might be running low power, or a damaged aerial, or a battery. Its signal could be too weak to survive the noise of routine commercial chatter, so the noise was legally switched off, on a schedule, forever. And because no one could be trusted to remember a schedule at 4 in the morning, after 8 hours of headphones, the clocks in radio rooms were printed with red wedges over those minutes, not a note pinned to the wall. The clock face itself was manufactured, with the law drawn onto it. You didn't have to know the rule. You had to be able to see it. Move forward to the 1960s, and this profession looks permanent. The world merchant fleet is growing. Every ship above the threshold carries a certified man in a dedicated room. The trade has schools feeding it, unions representing it, a career ladder from junior operator to coast station, and a title that keeps getting more technical as the equipment does. Radar, direction finding. By the 70s, satellite terminals sitting alongside the Morse key. That last part reads like security. More systems, more equipment, more indispensable. It was the first signal, and it pointed the other way. Because when the room filled up with new equipment, the man in it stopped being a communicator and started being a maintainer. The British Union representing this grade changed its own name to include electronics. That's what it looks like when a job's center of gravity moves. The communication function, the thing the treaty had actually mandated, was becoming the smaller half of what he did. A function that shrinks inside a job doesn't defend the job. The second signal arrived in 1979, when commercial maritime satellite service began operating. From that point, a ship could reach shore through a satellite link, voice and telex, dialed, with no hand sending at commercial speed, and no queue. Notice what that did to the two halves of the job. The billable half went first. Commercial traffic moved to satellite because satellite was easier for the customer and easier for the ship owner. Through the 1980s, the paying work drained out of that room. The compliance half stayed, because the treaty still said a person. So by the mid-1980s, you have a profession whose revenue justification has largely evaporated and whose legal justification is fully intact. That's an unstable structure, and there's a tell that the people closest to it could read it. In 1985, the British Union representing radio and electronic officers merged into a larger maritime officers' union. The grade stopped having its own organization, 14 years before it stopped having its own jobs. Now, here's where it breaks down. In 1988, member states of the International Maritime Organization adopted amendments to the Safety of Life at Sea Convention, establishing the Global Maritime Distress and Safety System. Same convention that created the job in 1914. Same instrument, opposite direction. The new system moved the distress function out of a person and into a set of automatic and semi-automatic elements. Digital selective calling, so a ship could raise an alarm by operating a control rather than sending a signal by hand. Satellite distress channels. Float-free position beacons that transmit whether anyone aboard is conscious or not. Navigational warnings printed automatically. And shore-based rescue coordination centers holding the round-the-clock watch that used to sit in a cabin near the funnel. Understand why this won, because it wasn't a technical contest. Morse on 500 kHz still worked in 1999. It worked on the last day, as well as it had in 1930. The system that took over, was not more reliable at close range, and in some respects, it was less forgiving. What it did was eliminate a manning requirement. Break the shipowner's saving into its parts: one salary, at officer rate, one cabin, and one dedicated compartment, on a hull that earns by volume, 3 meals a day for the length of every voyage, and the obligation to have a qualified person awake for a fixed number of hours every day at sea, forever. Against that, hardware bought once, plus a service subscription billed by usage to a provider ashore, plus one additional certificate bolted onto the training of officers the ship already carries. A recurring wage became a capital purchase and a monthly line item. That's the entire mechanism. The watch didn't disappear. It got moved somewhere it could be bought by the unit instead of hired by the year, and the remaining shipboard duty was handed to bridge watchkeeping officers as an added responsibility. The changeover ran on a published schedule. Phase-in began on the 1st of February 1992, and full implementation was set for the 1st of February 1999. 7 years of notice, in writing, with a date on it. Which is the part that separates this from every other extinction in this series. These people knew, not vaguely, they knew the year and the month, and could count backwards from it. In July 1999, commercial Morse service in the United States is commonly cited as having closed with a final ceremonial message. The ceremony is remembered. The date it was scheduled around was fixed 11 years earlier. Now run the numbers, on grade 2. 3 things before any arithmetic, because this is where most accounts of this trade go wrong. We're pricing the single operator on a cargo ship, not the chief on a liner. We're assuming a working year of roughly 8 to 9 months under contract, because berths ran by voyage and the gaps between them were unpaid. And we're starting from nominal wages, then subtracting the deductions we know existed, without inventing figures for the ones we don't. Take the early period, where the surviving figures come from. Something like £6 a month, combining both employers, is the commonly cited figure for a liner operator around 1912. Grade 2, without passenger traffic, sat below that. Now the comparison that matters. An urban laborer in Britain around that time earned something in the region of 25 shillings a week. That's roughly £5 a month, for a man with no certificate, no tuition debt, no examination fee, and no requirement to be at sea. So the certificate bought him a margin over a man who held no certificate at all. The margin was thin. Then subtract. The tuition advance, repaid out of wages. The examination fee, already spent. Union dues. Rail fares to join ships. And 3 to 4 months a year with no contract and no income, which converts a monthly figure into an annual one at a rate the monthly figure never advertised. Do that, and the annual take of grade 2 lands at or below what a shore laborer earned by staying home. Anchor it in something you can hold. That monthly wage was worth roughly 10 passenger telegrams of the 10-word minimum kind. 10. He could pass a month's salary through his own key in an afternoon on a busy liner, and none of it was his. And the laborer comparison hides the real cost, which is that the laborer was home. The operator paid rent ashore anyway, kept a family he saw for a few weeks a year, and finished the year with the same money. That's grade 2. 85 years of legally mandated employment, priced at the wage of a man who needed no qualification at all. The job ended. The function did not. It went to 3 places, and you can find all 3 on any ship at sea right now. The first is the hardware. The distress watch is a circuit. Equipment on the bridge listens continuously for digital alarm calls without anyone attending it. A beacon mounted on the deck releases itself and transmits position if the ship goes down with the entire crew unconscious. That's the 16 sleeping hours from grade 2, extended to 24, and made permanent. Regulators didn't invent that principle in 1988. They had conceded it decades earlier, then spent 40 years not extending it. The second is the certificate. The examination didn't die. The job title did. Radio operating qualifications were folded into the training of deck officers, so the ship still carries people licensed to work the equipment. They carry it as one competency among many, on top of navigation and cargo and watchkeeping. One salary now covers what two used to. The third place is where the money went. The round-the-clock listening watch still exists, staffed by people, in shore-based rescue coordination centers. The commercial link runs through satellite service providers, billing by subscription and by usage. The watch was never abolished. It was centralized, then rented back to ship owners by the month. Count ships, not people. The headcount figures for this trade don't survive reliably. For 85 years, every merchant vessel above the size threshold in the world fleet carried a person whose legal purpose was to listen. Today, every one of those vessels carries equipment that does it, and no person whose purpose is that. The difference didn't all go into machines. Some of it went somewhere else. Part of it went into a service layer ashore that now charges rent for a duty, which used to be an unpaid extra on a telegram contract. Now the counterfactual, and it needs only one variable. Suppose the distress watch had been priced, not bundled free inside a commercial agreement about passenger messages, but invoiced as its own line. Every ship owner receives a bill each voyage. Safety watch, one man, this many hours, this much money. Then somebody would have owned that number. It would have appeared in accounts, been argued over, been compared against alternatives on a spreadsheet in 1988, when the alternatives arrived. A cost with a price has defenders, because someone's revenue depends on it. It never had one. For 85 years, the most important thing this profession did was the only thing nobody was ever charged for, and when the convention was amended, there was no invoice to defend, because there had never been an invoice. The clock in that cabin was manufactured with the law printed on its face, red wedges, twice an hour, so the rule was visible without being remembered. That was the whole arrangement, stated in an object. You weren't hired to run a radio, you were hired to be a line in a treaty. So find out what your own job is made of, not what you produce, not how well you do it. Ask who would keep paying for your position if the requirement to have someone in it were struck out tomorrow, and ask whether the answer is a customer or a clause.